Thank you for being here for our first basic Buddhist teaching since Ango. And I've been looking at a few different things to talk about tonight. Nothing seems to really be settling well for me. And the monks tomorrow. Okay. Are going to be talking about meditation practice, Chiezan. And something that I talked a little bit with Sokuzan earlier and been thinking about is, what are the common threads that permeate through Buddhism? That from the origins in India, there was a rich spiritual and cultural history that Buddhism came out of, and unique practices as it moved into China and Japan, up into Tibet and Southeast Asia. Different forms of Buddhism arose, sometimes almost unrecognizable from one another, but there has to be a common thread. I really wanted to consider that. What are the common threads that make Buddhism Buddhism? When does something stop being Buddhism? So this idea of methods and teachings, that the methods of Buddhism have evolved in as many places as Buddhism has found itself. The earliest methods the Buddha taught would be shamatha practice, mindfulness practice. Training the mind, calming the mind, taming the mind, all phrases that are used to provide some basic stability so that we can look at what can be very chaotic in the mind. And as Buddhism flourished in China, it took on new forms. We had more esoteric forms of Tiantai Buddhism, but the form we're most familiar with is Zen. Zen wasn't unique to China, and that's something I think is important, that while Buddhism looks different, it's all the Buddha's Dharma. But the method in Zen is formless. So shamatha, mindfulness practice, is a mindfulness of bringing the attention, bringing the awareness, bringing the consciousness to an object. The breath, a flame, an image. And Zen Buddhism, you could say, takes us into a more spacious area in that it does not give us an object of meditation. And then you move up into Tibet. Another form of Buddhism arose that was highly influenced by the forms of shamanism and pagan religions of the time, and you have very esoteric, and this is where those practices seem to become unrecognizable in some ways as the Buddha's Dharma. And even coming over into the West, we see a new form of Buddhism arising as Americans try to understand not how to just appropriate forms and culture and language, but what is the essence of the Buddha's Dharma? And what is the methods that we can use to see that truth for ourselves? So the common thread is a very simple teaching the Buddha gave 2,500 years ago. And it's stated in many different ways, but the way we hear it sometimes is all compounded phenomena is without self-nature. And every method of the Buddha's Dharma is endeavoring to point the students to that. So it's not like every form of Buddhism is trying to propagate a new goal or a new fruition. It is the realization that the Buddha taught that there is no self and there is no other. And so to break that down a little bit, all compounded phenomena is without self-nature. Everything we experience through the sense fields, sight, smell, taste, sound, touch, and mind is such a vast and dynamic sense field. That's our emotions, that's our logic, that's our reasoning, that's our recipes, that's our routes to the grocery store, our philosophies, our theologies. No matter how refined they are, no matter how successive they are in the way we're able to think about them, the Buddha says they are without self-nature. That what we are looking at appears solid or appears as a singularity is in fact the coming together of countless causes and conditions that we can't trace. And so these methods of meditating, of chanting, of visualizing, no matter how unique the forms appear, are endeavoring to point the students back to this truth. Something that sometimes occurs, and I feel like many of us have seen this in the West, is that is a very difficult concept to understand. And it's threatening, it's distasteful, it's not marketable. And so we find the Buddha's Dharma being diluted. And that's not to say that it's a bad thing, but if the path isn't tied into that understanding, that realization, that insight, we might not be able to call it the Buddha's Dharma. And something that I've been working a lot with Kelly, I've been teaching a lot of mindfulness. And next week, I'll start a mindfulness class at the community college, be working with all sorts of people from the public. We work with high schoolers. I was at a high school this week. We were at the Air National Guard base. We were at a church. And mindfulness can be a very valuable tool on the path. And sometimes it gets cherry picked out of Buddhism, and without the context can provide some relief relatively, which is much needed. But it often loses the context of helping a student take that next step. So we create some relative stability through the awareness of the breath, create some relative stability through the awareness of the sense fields. But we can't maintain that. We can't maintain that indefinitely. So once we invite somebody into this stability, it really requires a teacher and a lineage to help encourage the student to take the next step, you could say, which is much more frightening, because we lose the reference point. When we sit down to practice shikantaza, you are no longer taking one object over another. That in as far as you can have the attitude or the intention, you receive without discrimination.